welcome to the 12th video on the Literature and Publishing course, the third year core course for students of English literature at the University of Greenwich. This is the second video on a pair of detectives, one very well known, Sherlock Holmes, and the other a successor who's far less recognised today, Judith Lee. This video will focus on questions we can ask about one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes stories, A Scandal in Bohemia, the story that effectively launched Conan Doyle as the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. For even if Sherlock Holmes had first appeared in Conan Doyle's novel A Study in Scarlet in 1887, it wasn't until the monthly stories appeared in the Strand magazine that the detective began the journey towards becoming the icon we know today. At the end of the first video on Holmes, I promised you to return to gender, publishing history, and to proximity and personality, to the topical, in other words, and that's certainly what we're going to be doing here. Now, because it fits in so well to the approach we're taking on this course, I want to begin with this still from an episode of the BBC series Sherlock. The episode was called A Scandal in Belgravia and was first broadcast on New Year's Day in prime time 2012. And if you haven't seen the episode, I strongly recommend that you do. You can watch it either on the BBC iPlayer, if it's available to you, or through Box of Broadcasts that the university subscribes to. This particular scene that's relevant is also available on YouTube, and the link I've placed below this video. The still is taken from the meeting of Sherlock with Irene Adler. It's a farcical rewrite of the scene in A Scandal in Bohemia, where Sherlock criminally gains access to Irene Adler's bijou residence in St. John's Wood, Bryony Lodge, by posing as an amiable and simple-minded nonconformist clergyman who's been injured trying, so he set it up, to protect Irene Adler from a gang of roughs. In the BBC version, it's made clear that Irene Adler knows exactly what's happened, that the clergyman's injuries are set up and who Sherlock really is, and she enters the room entirely naked. John Watson turns up and a very amusing scene ensues. Of particular relevance here are those question marks next to Irene Adler. From Sherlock's point of view, we get to see several shots of John Watson. Sherlock reads him as we might read a text, looking for clues and drawing conclusions. But Irene Adler, he can't read at all. She remains illegible. And therein lies her attraction for him. She's not reducible to a set of easily decodable signs. In many ways, she presents herself as a flattering mirror of Sherlock himself. As she says in the BBC production, "I like detective stories and detectives. Brainy is the new sexy," and John Watson seems almost to be about to be seduced by her. Now, this scene raises all sorts of questions that are relevant to this course, not least, what are we detecting when we read as detectives? Are we looking for a crime committed by someone? Our answers, of course, will lie in the resources we can draw on to decode whatever it is we're detecting. Maybe we want to decode using what we already know. That, to me, is not as much fun as extending our knowledge, opening ourselves out to other archives and ways of thinking. We'll see, for example, what changes when we consider the interaction of text and image, or we place the story in the context of royal scandals in the news at the time, and by considering Irene Adler as a kind of what was called a new woman. Detection and its archives is also, and given my strong chapel background, it's no surprise, a powerfully ethical issue. We can read a lot of the set reading as opening up debates on what the actual crime is and who is the criminal. This is the case throughout the course. That was very clear in Henry Dunbar. In the red silk scarf, despite its very strict closed form, there's always the possibility that Lupin himself had committed the murder. In the murders in the Rue Morgue, there's apparently no crime, since the murder is an animal, until we interpret and evaluate the story through the discourses of gender and racial equality. Now, it amazes me every year that students think that Irene Adler is the criminal and that she's committing the crime of blackmail. So let's quickly revisit that and look for the clues that we can read in the text. First, though, the questions. These are all pretty obvious questions that we need to ask when we read crime fiction. Let's begin with Irene and ask what crimes she has actually committed. These are all pretty obvious questions we need to ask whenever we read crime fiction. What crimes are committed, who commits them, but then how are crimes to be defined, who defines them, and what discourses can we or do we activate to make that definition of a crime? Let's think about Irene and ask what crimes she has committed. First, what do we know of her? Sherlock Holmes has his files, his archive of newspaper clippings on which he now draws, his Google if you like. Sherlock Holmes finds she's an American opera singer, and he concludes that the king has had an affair with her. The king has written letters using his own seal and sent her at least one photograph. But Sherlock pooh-poohs all this as evidence that she can use against him. It's quite possible to read the clues, as he points out, in another way entirely. Mobilizing discourses of established criminal behavior, that is, until he gets the photograph that includes both Irene Adler and the king, he's able to dismiss everything. What's interesting is that Sherlock is nonplussed by this photograph, when by the 1890s there's a very substantial industry of composite fake photographs and photographic retouching. Look at this one. This is quite a typical example of a composite photograph from over 30 years before a scandal in Bohemia was published. It's a collage of several photographic images laid on top of one another in a kind of collage. It's good, isn't it? This is not a recent reconstruction. It's what was actually made in 1858. Why didn't Sherlock Holmes dismiss the photograph as just a fake, a composite, just as he dismissed all the other kinds of evidence? Well, because the plot demands it, of course. What is this plot demand? Well, actually, it's the demand of a sexist discourse of men together resisting a plot by a woman against one of them. It's a version of the homosocial discourse we've seen previously. It's taken for granted that the reality is that men stick together against a woman. Indeed, that very discourse, it's that discourse that casts Irene as a criminal. What crimes has she committed? At first, it seems pretty obvious. She's threatening the King of Bohemia with blackmail now that she's heard he's about to be married. She has said that she would send the photograph to the King of Scandinavia on the day the King of Bohemia's engagement to the Princess of Scandinavia is announced. What is her motive? Love for the king? She doesn't want to marry him to marry someone else. She's not asking for money or anything. Just it seems she's so much in love with him. And what evidence does the king adduce to prove this threat by Irene? Does he give Sherlock a letter in Irene's handwriting, a telegram from her, for example? No! Sherlock just believes the king. Of course he does. Of course he does. The discourse of homosocial alliance demands the reality of this. The plot demands that Sherlock Holmes believes the King of Bohemia. But if we turn our attention away from the reality that homosocial discourse takes for granted, we start to see rather a lot of other crimes committed by the men. The king himself admits 5 of them quite coolly. He's king, so he doesn't regard them as crimes, but crimes they are. And neither Holmes nor Watson comment on them. They don't contradict him. And then Sherlock Holmes himself commits perjury. Disguised as a horse groom, he acts as a witness to Irene Adler's wedding to Godfrey Norton. That's forgery, I believe. And in the very next column on the same page, Holmes explicitly asks Watson if he minds breaking the law or running a chance of arrest. For a good cause, of course. The cause of homosocial solidarity and the support of a monarchy. And what of the multiple deceits by which Holmes gets into Briony Lodge? They surely aren't legal, are they? A fake fight disguised as a clergyman, a smoke bomb being thrown into a house. Aren't they breaking the law? Watson does seem to have some compunction, as you can see here, but that's overwhelmed by the rules of homosocial alliance. And then at the end, when mirroring both the Lupin and Judith Lee's stories set on this course, we get a letter from the criminal, which closes down the mystery, or so it seems. Here we have Irene Adler claiming she will only use the photograph to protect herself from what she calls elsewhere in the letter, so formidable an antagonist. He has wronged her, she claims. Did he promise marriage? Did he just take her and use her and throw her over when he'd finished with her? Did she get pregnant by him? All are possible and did happen in real life, as we'll soon find out. But we don't really know. It's her word against the king's. And Sherlock seems to take hers in the end. In the end. The letter seems to change Holmes's mind about her and about the king. It seems to make him realize that Irene has not been the criminal at all, but rather the victim of a homosocial plot in which he has participated. The letter has enabled him to interpret the case through different discourses. Certainly, there is the discourse of sentimentality, the discourse of sympathy for the underdog, for the wronged, that I explored in the 6th video on Henry Dunbar. And just as in Henry Dunbar, this discourse places a higher justice outside the law and in a divine or heavenly realm. So we see here how Sherlock seems to realize that a different kind of justice is also at play, not just the homosocial, but the human. And that in turn asks us to interpret the story in terms of both gender, which I shall come on to later, and in terms of class. Already at the beginning, we see a class antagonism between Holmes and the king. Holmes sees through his disguise and is rather impatient with him. Holmes, Watson, and Irene Adler's beloved Godfrey Norton are all middle-class professional men. A hyper-educated gentleman detective, a doctor, and a lawyer. They win out in the end. They get what the king can't have, and is even afraid of having: a woman and a story. This is a story of the triumph of the professional middle classes against the aristocracy. It flatters thereby the target readership of the magazine the adventure was published in. Now, I haven't mentioned the magazine yet, but I assure you I will. Does Holmes come to accept Irene Adler because she chooses his class? That's possible. The crime in this discourse would be the antagonism between the aristocracy and the middle classes, a faint echo of a parliamentary division into the aristocracy supporting Tories and the middle class supporting Liberals that had been going on for over a century in Britain by the time this story came out. That discourse still leaves the homosocial intact. The class conflict remains between men for the possession of reality. What's added is simply a class element. It leaves men in possession of reality, the story to be told about reality, and the woman. But as I keep promising, we'll come back to gender later. In the meantime, I want to think about how to enrich our readings by more specific context, and indeed by giving you some real-life background to the agency of both men and women at the time. Now, you'll have seen this slide before. You remember I took an attack on sensation fiction to analyze sensation fiction without actually attacking it myself. And it's that attack that I shall be returning to again and again on this course. Here, I won't be thinking about all of these elements that you can see on the screen, and certainly not in as much detail as with Henry Dunbar. Instead, I'll just be focusing on those in yellow, the effect of periodicals, and proximity and personality. Proximity is the relation of a story to news and giving a feeling of closeness to the reader in general, and an element of proximity which is called personalities, which is a game with the reader that suggests that the texts are really about specific individuals in the news. In effect, all these three elements, periodicals, proximity, personalities, are concerned with news, the circulation of information, how and what is circulated. Time is the operative term here, but not in the formal sense of the hermeneutic cycle, but rather in a much vaguer sense. The sense of what stories were contemporary, or at least circulating at the time, that might have served to resonate with the text. Now, what does this resonating actually mean? Well, in other words, it means what archives, what intertextual corpora might have helped a scandal in Bohemia to have been so successful. What other stories were there in the news that chimed with it, that resonated with it? Now, to answer that, we need to consider where the story was originally published and when. I've said it was aimed at the middle class men, but it's not quite as simple as that. Then I'll outline some recent scandals that would have prepared the way for the adventure, scandals that would have made it seem more proximate, nearer to the reader's world. You can easily find a lot of materials online that tell you that a scandal in Bohemia is designed to seem part of the reader's world. It mentions real places in London like Baker Street and Marylebone, St John's Wood, at the Edgware Road, Regent Street, Charing Cross, the Langham Hotel. Watson even specifies the date at the start of the story, the 20th of March, 1888. Bohemia, in the meantime, was a real estate, a separate, though part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a time when royalty was very much part of celebrity culture. Queen Victoria had started off the use of the media to create celebrity for herself, and her children and her grandchildren, who were married into royal families right across Europe, learned the trick from her. Manipulate the media, manipulate the population. To see a king in a monthly magazine where a scandal of Bohemia was published wasn't unusual at all. But all that's obvious. Instead, I want to place a scandal in Bohemia in a context that, to my knowledge, has been far less well explored, that of royal scandals. And then to end, we'll think about the contemporary media phenomenon of the new woman, which is, I confess, much more established a reading than the story's connection to royal scandals, which I'm going to turn to next. Obviously, we're changing and extending the archive. That's of particular interest to me, and I urge you to think about its implications. But before we go any further, I want to remind us of what's at stake when uncovering these archives mobilized by the story, or by any story for that matter. For if we manage to uncover relevant archives, whether accidentally or deliberately, isn't it profoundly flattering of us, as it was to original readers as well, to readers everywhere? I don't know about you, but I still get a shiver down my spine when I make connections across texts, even if those connections are not explicit. This is a key reward for readers that the game of detection gives. Now, Deborah Wynne, in her excellent book on the sensation novel and the Victorian Family magazine, it came out almost 20 years ago now, suggested that periodicals encouraged intertextual reading simply because the technology pushed lots of texts together into one unit, into the same point in time and space, as she has it. I wonder if this practice of reading intertextually, of mobilizing archives of news by readers, and the pleasures that come with that mobilization, came to be exploited by media producers like Conan Doyle and his publishers. They like to create and publish texts which allow the reader to make connections to items in the news media, perhaps to other items on the same page or in the same magazine, or even in other news media. Now, we certainly see that in the 2012 BBC updating of A Scandal in Bohemia to A Scandal in Belgravia. It's set in our world, full of generalized references to news stories of the time. And appreciating those resonances with the archive involves a whole set of key terms, with the game as dominant. The reader's game of detection with the text involves mobilizing an appropriate archive for the time, whether in 2012 that was beheading videos and naughty red-headed princesses, or in 1891, other scandals. Now, in what follows, I don't want you to think at all that the archives I'm going to be suggested were connected, were deliberately mobilized by either the author or publisher in advance. I have no idea whether they were or not, and I don't care. We're focusing on readers as key terms, not authors. What I am suggesting is that these discourses and archives and news items were available to be called on by readers. The reader and not the author is amongst that set of key terms. Can I remind you yet again? A Scandal in Bohemia was published in the Strand magazine. I suspect we will all know that. It was a monthly magazine founded by the media magnate George Newnes on the profits of his fantastically successful weekly paper for the commuter, Titbits. The Strand started in January 1891, that's the date on it anyway, and continued right up to March 1950, running to 711 issues. Now, if the first issue had January 1891 written on it, it was actually on sale well before Christmas 1890. And that's very important, and we'll come back to the date very soon. While the Strand was very successful almost straight away, sales increased in the early months, helped so the conventional wisdom goes, though it's not entirely proven, by the Sherlock Holmes stories. The magazine eventually settled down to a circulation of almost 500,000 copies a month, and that readership lasted well into the 1930s, which is a phenomenal record. It cost sixpence and usually had 112 pages. It was good value for money. It was also profusely illustrated. It was published in Burley Street, which is just off the Strand. And Nunes, published in 1910, having built a publishing empire which was already worth £1,000,000 in 1897. That was an incredible amount. And you really do need to think of the mega rich today for an equivalent. Now, what was this Strand magazine? And how did it present itself? Well, you can see from the cover that it prioritized the commercial. The Strand at the moment of this video in 2020 is a very, very poor reflection of what it used to be, one of the premier shopping streets of London. But close to the Strand, there were also lots of theatres and indeed publishing houses, either on the Strand or near it. And of course, the Strand turns into Fleet Street, not so very far away from what you can see on the cover. Now look at those telegraph wires in the picture on the cover too. The Strand's telling readers it's using the latest communications tech. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a carriage that's running towards us. The horse is in a bit of a froth. And there's, looks like a newspaper boy running across the street, right into the street where Burley Street would have been. Now, if you know the Strand, you may know where Southampton Street is. You see the label for Southampton Street on the left. Burley Street is 2 streets down towards Trafalgar Square from Burley Street. And the Lyceum Theatre is in the same block. The Strand magazine then is identifying itself absolutely with central London commercial and pleasure districts. Out of interest, and this will interest you, I'm sure, there are numerous notable Strand writers, including Agatha Christie, Rudyard Kipling, Somerset Maugham, H.G. Wells. War of the Worlds, in fact, appeared in condensed 4-minute in 1920. Dorothy Sayers, another great detective writer, Aldous Huxley, Arnold Bennett, Graham Greene, and even, this will be a surprise, Winston Churchill. I just want to give you an idea, when I list all that, of the immense success and centrality of the Strand magazine to the reading public, not just of the late 19th century, but for a great deal of the 20th century as well. Now, Scandal in Bohemia is the first of the 56 Sherlock Holmes stories published in between 1891 and 1927. It was illustrated by Sidney Paget, and I'll come on to the illustrations later on. But what I want you to note here is very carefully the date of A Scandal in Bohemia. Officially it's July 1891, but I've already said that although the first issue of the Strand was dated January 1891, it actually came out well before Christmas 1890, and that's normal practice for magazines. The story came out therefore in June 1891. Keep that in mind, it will become significant. Now, rather than just tell you the results of what I managed to find in the archive, how I came to identify the appropriate intertextual corpus and their relationship to proximity and personality, I think it's important to tell you a bit about how I arrived at them. It's not hard, but in my experience, students don't make use of the possibilities that the university gives them, and actually other resources are available that you could make use of as well. This is a great opportunity to prove that you can do independent research. It's very simple and it'll take just a minute or two. Now, I'm talking the online resources, principally, that Greenwich University makes available. Anyone in the university can play this game if they want. I'm just going to show you how I did it. You know the old adage, give someone a fish and feed them for a day, that's give you the results. Teach them how to fish and feed them for life. Well, here's the teaching of how to fish for life, how to fish for information. Now, I'm assuming you've logged into your account, so you need to go to Learning Support and click on the Databases, Journals and eBooks. And when you do that, you come to this particular site here. I'm sure you know this already. First, there's the 19th Century Periodicals UK, but of more use than the one that's being ringed here is this one. If you scroll down, you'll come to a bigger database, an aggregate one that searches over an abundance of sources for you. Other institutions have other databases, and I'll be using another one later on to show you. But Greenwich has Gale primary sources. You can use keywords to search over 3 databases at once. Enormous databases, that. Easy. Well, if you know what words you're searching for, it's easy. I was interested in royal scandals and came up with 2 major ones. Now, 2 out of these 3 involve the Prince of Wales. And so, I'll begin with him. On the right, you can see Edward, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. I'm not going to go through all his biographical details, but suffice it to say that he'd been married to Princess Alexandra of Denmark since 1863 in an arranged marriage. When he was very young, he wanted to get some army experience, and he attended manoeuvres in Ireland, during which an actress, Nellie Clifton, was hidden in his tent by his fellow officers. Prince Albert, even though he was very ill at the time, was appalled, and he visited Edward at Cambridge to issue a reprimand. Albert died just 2 weeks after the visit in December 1861. Queen Victoria was inconsolable, wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life, and blamed Edward for his father's death. She thought her son was frivolous, indiscreet, and irresponsible, and she wrote to her eldest daughter, who was one of her confidants, "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder." But she still received many of the subsequent women who were his mistresses, one of whom you can see on the left. This is the celebrity beauty Lily Langtry, who was Edward's mistress between 1877 and 1880. At this stage, she wasn't yet an actress, though you may have heard of her as a famous actress, and indeed she really was. But she took up acting in the 1880s when she became phenomenally successful. So, just before scandal in Bohemia. When she was the Prince of Wales's mistress, though, she was a painter's model, known as a famed beauty in society, and she was married. Now, Lily Langtry is an absolutely fascinating figure, but this isn't the place to go into her biography. What's key to my argument is actually this. Now, the physiognomy of the King of Bohemia is, can you not see, it's vaguely related to that of Edward. You can see it's the same kind of physical type. I don't want to make any specific connections, and as I've said before, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the connections are deliberate. The King of Bohemia, for example, does not have a beard, and he's got slightly more hair, but the type is familiar. The connections with Edward are available to those who want to make them. And then there's another resource that's freely available, which allows us to explore the connections between the King of Bohemia and the Prince of Wales much more closely. I'm talking about the proceedings of the Old Bailey. which is freely available online to anybody. And this is the record of the trial of the editor of Town Talk, a newspaper that specialized in pushing the limits of Victorian respectability. It was actually an anti-hypocrisy paper. The editor was Adolphus Rosenberg, and this is the libel that he was accused of in 1879. Ouch. The Prince of Wales and two other gentlemen whose names up to the time of going to press we have not been enabled to learn are mentioned as correspondents. We have been informed, though, that the HRH, the Prince of Wales, and Lord Lonsdale and Lord Lunsborough are the correspondents in the divorce case by Lily Langtry's husband. Ouch. That is, that Lily Langtry was being accused by her husband of having these three lovers. Nasty stuff, all in the press as well. The case was widely reported in the press. My searches in the database brought up thousands of hits, as you can see, though the trial lasted just one day. In fact, Lily Langtry's husband was not interested in divorcing her, and it was a fabrication, which didn't stop Rosenberg publishing the material. But what it did do was bring out the Prince of Wales' affair with Lily Langtry. The reality was that Lily Langtry did have lots of affairs, and she married men younger than her, a whole series of men. But it wasn't true that her husband wanted to divorce her. Rather, it was she who wanted to divorce her husband repeatedly, and she eventually managed to do so in 1897 through a legal wheeze in the USA. Though that's strictly speaking not relevant here. Much more relevant was that the Prince of Wales was in the news in a scandalous light, accused of a liaison with a woman who, by the time of a scandal in Bohemia, would be super famous as a very successful actress. And by super famous, I mean really famous. But that's not the only resonance with the Prince of Wales. There was another scandal that Prince Edward was involved in that was closer in time, incredibly close in time, to a scandal in Bohemia. In 1891, Edward was embroiled in what was called the Royal Baccarat scandal. It was revealed that he'd played an illegal card game for money the previous year. The prince was forced to appear as a witness in court when one of the players unsuccessfully sued his fellow players for slander after they had accused him of cheating. Ouch. Now, I went for my results here to the BNA, the British Newspaper Archive, rather than Gale primary sources, but the same point appertains. The intensity of coverage of a naughty royal. Thousands of occurrences of royal baccarat scandal in just June 1891. Even more crucially, look at the date. June 1891. There's even a picture there of the Prince of Wales in the witness box. Very embarrassing and very resonant with a scandal in Bohemia. A king or a future king being involved in illegal or incorrect activity. Ouch. The news coverage of the Royal Baccarat scandal took place the same month that a scandal in Bohemia came out. Now, again, I want to make this absolutely clear. I'm not suggesting clear intended connection. That is the point. It's all suggested activation. It's possible cross-reading. It's a cross-reading that connects unrelated texts with one another that the reader might make. It's an available possible cross-reading that the reader can make either consciously or not. But if the connections are made, the pleasure is all the greater. It's the activation of the principle of what Mansell called personality, reading a text as if it were coded references to real people in the news, real personalities. But there's more, and this time closer to the Central Europe, where Bohemia is and was a real country. Here we see the official engagement photo of the heir of the Austrian Empire, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, with his future wife, the Princess Stephanie. Here we see a photo of the Baroness Marie Alexandrine von Vetsera, a member of Austrian high society. Marie Alexandrine met the Crown Prince in November 1888, and she began a 3-month-long affair. But it's also possible, we don't really know, that she might have begun the relationship 3 years earlier, when she would have been just 15. Do you think it's going to end well? Well, what we find is that the death of Rudolf, friend of the Prince of Wales, as this newspaper report says, is reported first as caused by apoplexy. The son of the present Emperor Francis Joseph, he is the heir of the empire, and he dies of this, some kind of heart attack. Very strange. And he dies in Mayerling. You can see that in the bottom paragraph. A small shooting box, not far from the capital city, and pretty isolated. Have you noticed something on the screen? I'm not going to point it out to you. If you have, good for you. What's very interesting is that over the coming weeks, the press shows itself to be involved in detection. The interpretation of Rudolf's death changes very dramatically as the press discovers more and more clues about what really happened. For example, the Sheffield and Rotherham Independent suggests this. More versions of the tragedy, murder and suicide, an accumulation of horrors. Whose murder? Whose suicide? Well, you've only got 3 characters in this particular story. And here it is. The one that they're able to arrive at. The truth seems to be that the late Crown Prince, in company with Marie Vetsera, with whom he had intimate relations during the past 4 months. I said 3 months earlier. Other people say 3 years. Who knows? They went to the shooting lodge where they passed the following day together. And the morning of the 30th, they were both found dead in the same room. The prince apparently had shot the Baroness, and the prince then committed suicide. Look at this grotesque story. The lady lay extended upon the bed with flowers strewn over her body. It's not known who placed the flowers there, but as the Baroness was very romantic, it's likely enough that she had introduced them into the chamber herself and had decked herself for death. Horrendous story all over the press. Now, none of these scandals, and there was a huge scandal, the Mayerling murder-suicide, where the heir of the Austrian Empire had murdered his mistress and then committed suicide himself. None of these scandals are mentioned in A Scandal in Bohemia. But I hope you can see how the story might resonate with them, might seem, even if the reader is not at all conscious of these connections, how they make the story more proximate than the mere listing of places would make it. They offer narrative possibilities that the news stories themselves don't take. The King of Bohemia didn't murder Irene Adler and then commit suicide. And so far as we know, he didn't indulge in illegal card games, though he certainly committed other crimes. But he might have done any and all of these things at the beginning of the story when it's first introduced. And those narrative possibilities are there early in the story before Sherlock Holmes closes them down with the narrative solutions. I think it's hard for us now, having read the story so many times and perhaps seen filmic versions of it, to envisage these other possible ramifications, these other possible cross-readings that the reader might have activated while reading the story. But I do think it's worth excavating these archives if we are to recognize the difference of the past from us, to recognize the operation of time, that the past is different. I hope I need hardly say that these scandals nourish the discourse of class conflict between the virtuous middle classes and the immoral, immoderate aristocracy given up to extreme and perverse desires. And of course, it reinforces the masculine homosocial that uses women. Or does it? And at this point, I think it's definitely time that we turn to gender. Now, Irene Adler is commonly accepted today as a reaction to what was called the New Woman at the time. Now, what was this New Woman? Histories normally tell us that the term was invented by the popular woman author Ouida in exchange with another woman writer, Sarah Grand, in a couple of issues of the North American Review in 1894. But in fact, the term had been around for several years previously. All Ouida did was just use it and, for literary historians, make it available to us. Here we find the term the New Woman in an 1889 review of Ibsen's A Doll's House, where the terms applied to the heroine Nora. I don't know if you've already read or studied A Doll's House. Fantastic play. But here we find the reviewer relating snatches of conversation where the term seems to be used casually, as if the user of it didn't need to define it. What's important is that women were becoming increasingly numerous and prominent in British journalism and in British cultural life and working life in general, promoting themselves as never before and capitalizing in new ways on the changing conditions of journalism. Now, after the 1882 Married Women's Property Act, married women could even earn and keep their own money and own property. Women, in other words, could be independent. And single women no longer needed to be under the protection of their nearest male relative. The New Woman was a term that seemed to encapsulate new possibilities for women. Now, what was the New Woman? That's a bit vague, what I've just said. Well, the New Woman was very unstable, and this is important. The New Woman was unstable as a figure. Its meaning depended on who was using the term and for what purposes. But the quotation that you can see on the screen from Carolyn Nelson's New Woman Reader sums the idea up, I think, very well. What I do want to stress is the term is a media construction. There never was a new woman. It was a new idea of what women were and could be, independent from men and emancipated from men's control. And for many critics, for many literary critics, it's pretty clear that Irene Adler is the embodiment of a new woman. My question is, are matters really as simple as that? What does it mean to be emancipated from patriarchal control? Now, to go some way to answering that question, I want to turn to another and vital part of A Scandal in Bohemia, and a vital part of the success of Sherlock Holmes in general, the illustrations by Sidney Paget. Lots of critics have emphasized how vision is prioritized in the Sherlock Holmes stories. It's no accident that A Scandal in Bohemia centers on a photograph. And the initial pages, when Holmes is analyzing the letter from the king, he focuses on what can be observed with the eyes. But when Christopher Pittard, in an excellent chapter in the altogether very fine Cambridge Companion to Sherlock Holmes, available in the library, when Chris Pittard links the famous distinction between seeing and observing that Holmes makes in A Scandal in Bohemia to how the Strand used illustration, and he spends some wonderful pages discussing the illustrations of the story, he focuses on, very brilliantly, the complex formal games that the illustrations play, a game of doublings and duplication. But I want to think of the illustrations very briefly in a different way. Well, how do the illustrations portray Irene Adler, the supposed embodiment of the new woman, or the woman, indeed? Well, she only appears in 4 illustrations. Here she is in the church waiting to get married, while Godfrey Norton hauls in a disguised Holmes to act as a witness to the ceremony. We can see she's veiled and has an elaborate hat, but there's no detail here, though. It's just the shape of her outline that identifies her as a woman. The text tells us that she's very beautiful, but the illustrations never display that. We don't even display it in generic terms. There she is. And here she is again. There's hardly more detail here, though she seems to have dark hair, I suppose. The veil is half drawn up, but she's no features beyond generic eyes and a nose. She doesn't even have a clear mouth. She doesn't seem to have a character. And then there's this, the most detailed of all, a portrait of Irene Adler as the disguised Sherlock Holmes being carried into her house. Again, the dark hair. Does she still have a hat on? It's not clear to me. And perhaps she's got the same clothes as in the church scenes. But hard to be sure. Again, she is generic. She's really not the woman, but a woman. And then there's finally this. Perhaps the most famous of all the illustrations from A Scandal in Bohemia, and certainly the most discussed. Irene Adler, disguised as a youth, saying, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." A lot of ink has been spilled on how this represents Irene as liberated from conventional gender roles, as she walks through the London streets at night dressed as a man. It's a habit she seems to have. But one of the points surely is that, yet again, compared to the detail we see in the depiction of the men, she's very generic. Anonymous. I could never identify Irene Adler from this illustration alone. I need the words to tell me that it is actually her. In short, the image of Irene Adler remains illegible, impossible to pin down, so unlike the men. Except, of course, for Sherlock Holmes, who I wouldn't recognize in his disguises either without the text to tell me. And I wonder if today we can take that mirroring illegibility as offering a possibility for resistance, as perhaps a sign, another and perhaps neglected version of the new woman. One of the key points made in Murders in the Rue Morgue was that the detective has to enter into the mind of the criminal. And we certainly see attempts at that here, as Holmes tries to think through how to get Irene Adler to reveal the hiding place of the photograph. To do that, he has to nullify himself, become another person, not just disguise himself, but become her. Irene Adler has that capacity too. Irene Adler can use the same technique Sherlock Holmes has against him. I'm not talking about deduction or induction, but playing the same game of entering your opponent's mind. Is this an aspect of the New Woman? Yes, I think it is. For women in the late 19th century were, as I've said, entering what had been hitherto been occupations either exclusively practiced or totally dominated by men. They were riding bicycles and smoking. Ouida, to whom the term New Woman is often attributed, as I've said, didn't like that. She was what a few years ago used to be called a difference feminist. That is, a feminist who wants to maintain a specifically women's identity that is radically different from men's. Ouida didn't regard herself as a new woman at all. But self-identified new women writers did seek to take over men's practices and discourses, men's stories and activities. Is Irene Adler then a new woman, at least in this, as playing a better game than Sherlock Holmes? I don't know. She remains to me illegible, ambiguous, and it's perhaps through that very illegibility and ambiguity that she's utterly able to escape from us, detective readers, and from Sherlock Holmes himself. He never finds her again. He only has her trace, the photograph.